Can Oricorio and Greninja keep us from another Darkrai Giratina dominated metagame? I don't know. Let's go ahead and dive into our latest meta report for Pokemon Pocket and take a look at what we can learn from the numbers in our largest tournaments this past weekend. We had almost 2,000 players compete in our largest Pokemon Pocket tournaments this past weekend, and Darkrai Giratina was the most represented starting deck with a bullet, making up 14% of those deck lists. Coming in at number 2, we have Greninja Snorlax Berry Variations at 9%. We have Carnivine Crobat Arceus decks clocking at 3rd at 8.5%. We have Greninja Variations largely featuring Oricorio, but some featuring Tapu Lele as their secondary attacker at 8%. We have Garchomp, of all things, popping up, supported by Rampardos at 8%. We have Charizard Incineroar coming in at 6%, and we have Solgaleo Skarmory, the #1 most popular deck from our first weekend of events, clocking in at just 4% here in week 2. When we look at some week-over-week comparisons, we see some predictable changes, but also some surprises. Darkrai Giratina doubles up its starting metagame share after being the best performer last week. Charizard Incineroar and Solgaleo Skarmory both increased in a meta share after a middling first weekend of tournaments. Greninja Berry Variations increased by a small amount after a flat debut. And our other 3, Carnivine Crobat, Greninja Variations, and Garchomp Rampardos, weren't even on the pie chart to start last week, so they all have massive gains here this weekend too. To try and draw some conclusions about the strength of these various archetypes, we use a metric I refer to as the performance delta, which measures how much an archetype grew in meta share between the starting distribution of our field and the top performers. This week we had over 200 deck lists that had 70+% win rates in the Swiss rounds of these tournaments. And if we look at how our decks perform between these, we see the Greninja Variations featuring Oricorio and sometimes Tapu Lele had our strongest performance, over doubling their starting to top performing. Darkrai Giratina was number 2, increasing its metagame share from 14 to 25%. Carnivine Crobat had a nominally positive performance, going from 8.5% up to 10, while everything else was either flat in the case of Solgaleo Skarmory or decreased its metagame share overall, with Charizard Incineroar, Garchomp Rampardos, and Greninja Variations all getting smaller in between these two groupings of deck lists. As we start looking into some specific details, I want to start with the new deck on the scene that was our strongest performer overall this first weekend, Greninja Variations, largely featuring Oricorio as their secondary attacker. This was one of the only archetypes in our major tournament that boasted an incredibly strong win rate against Darkrai Giratina decks. The basic idea here is relatively straightforward. You put Oricorio up front, and then with Shaman to support it, it takes an incredible amount of time for Darkrai chip shots to clip through it, which gives you plenty of time to set up your Greninja to deal 20 points a turn to them, as well as your Giratina to be a big blaster for itself. You also have lightning energy, so you can do some attacking there as well. This archetype doesn't just have favorable matchups into the top dog, though. It's very good against every archetype that's leaning on EX Pokemon in general, meaning it has a strong matchup into Incineroar Charizard and Solgaleo Skarmory, which were both popular in this first weekend. It's not a complete dog in the other matchups either, being relatively even against Carnivine Crobat Arceus Variations and being solid into the Giratina Snorlax Berry decks as well. The astute among you will note I commented that most of the Greninja decks were featuring Oricorio as their secondary attacker. However, there was a small number of players as well playing Tapu Lele in this slot. This gives the deck a very different dynamic against Darkrai Giratina. Instead of stonewalling them with an electric Pokemon, you have an incredibly efficient attacker that deals 40, 60, and even 80 points of damage to a fully charged opposing Giratina for just a single energy, that also only gives up 1 knockout point when your opponent finally is able to position to clean it out. This also gives the deck list the ability to play Psychic Energy profitably, which allows your Giratinas to start attacking a whole heck of a lot sooner in the Giratina Darkrai matchup, even when your Tapu Lele is nowhere to be found. Now, unfortunately, the way Limitless groups their deck lists on their website, there isn't a clean and easy way for me to break out matchup data between the Oricorio variations and the Tapu Lele variations. So if there's anybody out there watching that's played both of these and might have some insight on how exactly these two differ in some of the more popular matchups, I would love to hear about it in the comments down below. Personally, I'm looking forward to trying them both out on my live stream this week so I can gain some firsthand experience with them. As we move into looking at Darkrai Giratina developments this week, I want to call out the particular list that took exactly first in one of our two major tournaments. It was featuring a one-of copy of Komala as a 5th basic Pokemon. This particular player played against the Greninja Oricorio deck a number of times in their tournament, and they beat it every single time, I would wager, in large part due to the fact that they have this basic Pokemon who, for 2 colorless energy, can one-shot an opposing copy of Oricorio. It's going to be very interesting to see if this piece of technology becomes more widespread in the Darkrai Giratina deck in our tournaments next weekend, because it feels like this is a very clean piece of technology for taking a matchup that in our data for this weekend very heavily favors the Oricorio deck and can kind of flip it on its head at the cost of exactly 1 deck slot in our most popular and likely best deck in the current meta game. Carnivine Crobat Arceus looks to be positioning itself as the premier aggressive deck in our metagame, and looking at its absolute best possible draws, it's easy to see why this is. When everything comes together for you, you have Zubat with Crobat, you have a Rare Candy, you have a Carnivine, you have an Arceus. You can hit for 50 with your Carnivine on the first turn, and on the second turn you can hit for an additional 50 Rare Candy into that Crobat, hit for 30, allowing you to do 130 over those first 2 turns of the game, or 170 into something like an opposing copy of Darkrai that's weak to grass. That being said, that's obviously a pie in the sky style scenario, so the incredibly consistent Darkrai Giratina deck actually tends to be favored against this deck, relying on a more inconsistent stage 2. Looking at the matchup table for the Carnivine Crobat deck overall, I'll be interested to see if it has staying power as this metagame develops more. I say this because the 2 strongest matchups for this deck are Charizard Incineroar as well as Solgaleo Skarmory, which are both deck lists that had smaller metagame shares going into this week, and they both underperform, meaning they're likely to shrink moving forward as well. It was, however, relatively even matched against the Greninja variations. Both the Oricorio builds as well as the Snorlax Berry builds are about 50%. So if those decks remain popular, this Carnivine Crobat deck could remain relevant just because it's relatively even there. While Solgaleo Skarmory had a relatively flat performance overall this week, being 4% of our starting metagame and 4% of our top performers, I wouldn't be surprised if it actually loses more ground in the coming week, looking at how its matchups played out. It still has an absolutely abysmal matchup against Darkrai Giratina, which had an incredibly strong performance for the second weekend in a row. I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to run metagame share. It's very poor against Arceus Crobat, and it's only relatively even against things like Giratina Snorlax. The only places it really shines are against other deck lists that also struggled this week, such as Garchomp Rampardos and Charizard EX Incineroar. In terms of particular card selection choices, there wasn't really a ton of innovation this week in Skarmory Solgaleo lists looking them over, but a noteworthy call out is our sample list here. A number of the other ones with stronger finishes were playing more support cards, i.e. 2 copies of Lily. So perhaps if you want to be playing the Metal Lion, leaning on more cards that can keep it alive longer could perhaps be the way to go. Garchomp Rampardos popped up as a new deck in the major tournaments this weekend after not really being at all present in our first week of events. This pairing seems rather elegant on the surface. You always get to start on your Gibble, and you can Rare Candy up into Chomp. However, if you draw into your Fossils, Rare Candy doubles up with Rampardos as well, and supporting cards like Lily can double dip, healing both of your threats to boot. Rampardos also covers a weakness that Garchomp EX has against Oricorio, which is an ever-present threat in our current meta game. This deck list position overall is likely to make or break based on where our Giratina Darkrai percentage goes, as this is one of the many decks in our metagame that has a very poor matchup there. That being spread, if the Giratina Darkrai metagame percentage stabilizes relatively low or perhaps about where it's at, this deck list could have some staying power as it seems to have a solid split matchup into most of the other popular decks that are running around right now, and is very reasonable into everything else portion of the field thanks to how fast Rampardos can hit for big damage and the flexibility that Garchomp's linear attack gives you to attack past things that are stalling. Stop me if you've heard this story before, but the Greninja Berry Snorlax deck featuring Giratina as its secondary attacker had relatively even matchups into most of the other popular decks in the field this week, but it really struggled against Darkrai Giratina. I'm trying to keep a healthy, optimistic look on our metagame overall, but I gotta be honest, as I sift through more and more of this data, I fear we are likely headed back towards a similar state to where we were before this set released, with one deck being S tier above everything else. Finally, Charizard Incineroar, despite having a mediocre performance overall this weekend, is actually one of the few decks from among our more popular that has a relatively even match against Giratina Darkrai. It's heavily favored against the Berry Greninja decks that we looked at before this. However, it really struggles against more aggressive decks like Arceus Crobat, and obviously it's dead to rights, so the format's Yellow Demon Chicken or Oricorio, winning that matchup an absolutely abysmal 20% of the time. Like I mentioned a minute ago, I wouldn't be surprised if the format ends up very similar to where it was before this card pack release, with Darkrai Giratina being #1 with a bullet at the top of it, especially with the innovation that we saw in the winning deck list from one of the tournaments this past weekend, featuring technology that allows it to beat Oricorio, the one thing that seems to be preying on this top metagame staple. It'll be interesting to see if there's anything else that we haven't found in the metagame yet that can pop up as we head on into our third week of tournaments. To have a little bit of sunshine as opposed to doom and gloom, however, it's also worth calling out that this being the second weekend of our current metagame also means that we're halfway through it. So if we look at results after the third week, and it's mostly Darkrai Giratina as far as the eye can see, there's only another week after that until we get a new card pack at the end of the month based on data mines, where hopefully we'll get something that can meaningfully knock Giratina off its #1 in the metagame perch. If you're someone like myself who enjoys keeping tabs on the latest metagame threats, but you don't love playing them personally because mirror matches bore you to tears, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss my new decks roundup tomorrow, where I combed through these almost 2,000 deck lists looking for the most successful rogue decks that we'll be featuring. If you'd like this meta report today, be sure to smash that like button to hopefully help it reach some more people. I appreciate everybody that made it all the way through to the end of today's video, and I hope your next booster pack is an excellent one.